Well, Amy Pate is a research director at START, a center that studies terrorism and responses to terrorism, based at the University of Maryland in the U.S. Thanks so much for joining us. Amy, one of the more salient points this report makes is to point out a correlation between the 2003 Iraq invasion and the almost nine-fold increase in the number of deaths in terror attacks since that time. Why that relationship between the two?
I think there are several things you can say about that. One is, in general, when governments are destabilized, you tend to see increases in political violence. Not just terrorism either, just political violence in general. And so the government of Iraq has never been able to fully establish control over all of its territory. It's also followed relatively exclusionary policies, and so it has systematically excluded especially Sunni Arabs from different levels of governance, which gives root for groups like Daesh to recruit disaffected Sunni Arabs within Iraq. Pair that with the sort of collapse of the Syrian state and the eruption of the Syrian civil war, which really gave Daesh, which formerly was al-Qaeda in Iraq before they broke from al-Qaeda, sort of new recruiting grounds, and really helped revitalize them as an organization. So now you have a situation where borders aren't controlled, there are high levels of violence in general, carried out by a wide range of actors. All of that gives oxygen to a group like us.
Amy, it's also worth noting that while so much attention is given to victims of terror attacks in Western countries, the vast majority of deaths are shared among 5 non-Western, mostly Muslim countries.
Mm-hmm. Yes, by far the majority of deaths, as you mentioned, take place in just a few countries. And even in Nigeria, which is sort of mixed Muslim and Christian, most of the deaths are in the Northeast, primarily in Muslim majority areas of Nigeria. Then, of course, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, and Syria. So these are most of the victims of Boko Haram, most of the victims of Daesh and all of its many affiliates are in fact fellow Muslims. Although they disagree a lot on political implementation of Islam or how Islam is practiced, they are in fact killing their fellow Muslims.
Amy, what particular impact do you hope this report will have?
Well, I think there are several impacts. As far as sort of public knowledge, I think in general, information about terrorism tends to be highly emotional, highly political. And so just putting out there for the public to see, like, these are the actual numbers. These are discrete counts. These are not slanted with sort of a political agenda. It's just getting, this is the information that's available out there, gives people a little bit more perspective on both the scope of the problem and really where the problem is concentrated geographically and what are the groups that are most problematic. So that's, I think, the largest goal for any report like this is to enhance public awareness and public education. Most policymakers have already had access to this, so it really is more of a public information campaign, I think. There are other ways that we've been talking to policymakers now for years to sort of broaden their understanding of what drives terrorism, what drives radicalization, and those types of questions.
Amy, finally, how did you personally feel about what this report revealed? Was there anything that came as somewhat of more of a shock to you?
So, I mean, I study terrorism. I do this every day, all day. It's my job. So nothing was particularly startling, except when you run the actual numbers, the fact that Boko Haram and Daesh are together responsible for such a large percentage of all terrorism fatalities. You know, on a day-to-day basis, you see that they're killing a lot of people, that they're very active, that their attacks are very lethal. So they kill a lot of people at one time. But at the end of the year, when you are able to sort of add everything up, it is somewhat startling that two groups are such dominant drivers of global trends.
Okay, the numbers alone are horrifying. Amy, thank you so much for joining us from Maryland.
Thank you for having me.